From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. When you think of someone who goes to a restaurant and doesn't tip the waiter, what kind of person comes to your mind? That person has never been depicted as a very nice person in North American culture, right? But in a not too far off future, could that be all of us? With Ontario's new labor laws, could tipping become a thing of the past? Canada's tipping culture has often confused me a lot. Canadians tip many types of service, from bellhops to Uber drivers and deliveries, also hairstylists, spa technicians, and baristas. But do I tip my RMT? And what about retail workers who have to engage with customers all day, or flight attendants who also have service-based jobs but whom we don't tip? It appears that there are invisible rules and distinctions on who we tip and who we don't. And the conversation has been quite divided. Some say we need the tipping to ensure a living wage rather than just a minimum wage. And others argue that the employer should ensure that living wage, not customers. Meanwhile, Ontario, unlike elsewhere in Canada, has had a much lower minimum wage for liquor servers, leading to a culture of tipping, not just for great service, but to help balance this disparity. Now, starting 2022, front-of-house workers in hospitality will see their base hourly pay rise from $12.50 to $15 to match a price hike in general minimum wages. But a minimum wage is still not a living wage, especially in Ontario, where that's actually closer to $20, according to the Living Wage Network. So, should we keep tipping? And will these new laws have any impact on our tipping culture? Already there are restaurants that are banning tipping. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? The Star's business reporter Rosa Saba is here, and she has some tips for us. Hi, Rosa. Great to have you again.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's start off with a primer on this one. What exactly was the wage framework for liquor servers and others before these changes, and what's essentially changed?
Yeah, so this change is actually going to happen on January 1st. And as of January 1st, Ontario will no longer have a liquor server wage. It's something that has actually been sort of going down in popularity among the provinces in recent years. So BC got rid of theirs earlier this year. Alberta's ended several years ago. And now Quebec will be the only province to have one. And it just means essentially what it sounds like, the different minimum wage for any person whose job is to serve alcohol. And the idea is that those people make quite a lot in tips. And so they're being paid a lower minimum wage by their employer in order to sort of make up that balance and account for the fact that they're making a large amount of their wage in tips. And so what's going to happen is on January 1st, that wage will no longer exist. We're already getting a bump in the regular minimum wage up to $15, and they're going to get the same thing. So all workers in a restaurant or in a bar are going to make $15 an hour, regardless of what their job is.
Right. And there's been a lot of conversation about, what's the living wage and what's the minimum wage, and a little bit about that. We'll talk about that later as well. But can you explain the North American tipping culture to me a little? How much do people usually tip? Who do they tip? And how does that work out? How does that get distributed? It's not very common in a lot of other countries,
Yeah, so I think in North America, we all have opinions about how much we should tip, right? And this is super anecdotal, but just in my conversations about tipping for the past few stories I've done, I've kind of asked people, has your tip percentage gone up? And it turns out a lot of people actually have seen overall tip percentages going up. I think it used to be normal to tip 15% for good service, and then extra if it was really good, or less if it was bad. And that's kind of what I used to do. And during the pandemic, according to Restaurants Canada, actually, people are tipping more percentage-wise. So it's not just anecdotal. Anecdotally, I think that I don't know exactly when this change happened for me, but I would say 20% is closer to my baseline. And I've even noticed on the debit machines when they're prompting you, sometimes 15% won't even be an option, right? So I think slowly, and perhaps in part due to the pandemic, 20% has become a much more common tip for sort of standard good service. What happens afterwards, of course, is what a lot of people don't know unless they have worked in the industry. So And, it's a bit confusing because all restaurants do it differently, frankly. I've sort of encountered a number of different structures. The tip technically belongs to the server, it's generally not part of their paycheck. There's a small minority of restaurants, especially sort of corporate, like bigger places, where the tip is actually controlled and taxed. So it goes on, it's part of their paycheck, it's taxed, there's EI and that kind of thing. But that's not super popular among anyone, really, obviously, because people don't like to have taxes or other like EI and CPP taken off their pay. And then, of course, it also means more payments for the employer. So that's not super common. Usually what happens is one of two things. Either all the tips are put into a tip pool and then they're given out in certain percentages. So that way it's a little more fair, or the server has to give a certain percentage of their tips or their sales to other workers, like the cooks, like the busboys, like the bartenders, that kind of thing. In both of these scenarios, I think it's safe to say the servers are getting the bulk of the tips percentage-wise. It's just that with the tip pool, the idea is that, say, two servers work one shift together, same amount of time, they're going to get the same tips. It kind of encourages teamwork. But yeah, like broadly speaking, the servers end up taking it home more money than the cooks, for example.
And it's just tipping culture is just so ingrained in North America, considering that this is not really a thing in so many other countries where generally there's the concept of adequate minimum wages and many do not rely on tips for a livable income, right? I'm often confused myself, like, who do I tip? How much do I tip? And like you said, now technology has made it so much more easier because it's providing us with choices, like exactly how much we are supposed to tip. So this is quite seamlessly integrated into the culture here at this point. Do you see this shifting with these changes anytime soon?
No, no, I don't. Because as you mentioned, we tip for a lot of things. We tip a lot of different people who do not make a lower wage. You tip when you go to the spa, when you're getting your nails done, right? Sometimes you even leave a small tip when you're just ordering something at a cafe, even if it's only because the debit machine makes it seem like you have to, and if you look at other provinces, again, Ontario is the second to last province with a liquor server wage. I went to BC recently and I still tipped. Everyone still tipped. And I don't even think my percentage went down. I didn't think about it. So I don't think that eliminating liquor server minimum wage is going to eliminate tipping culture or really change tipping culture that much. When you talk about it being ingrained in North America, there's no real reason. There's no one reason why we tip versus other places. It's kind of like a chicken and the egg scenario. We tip because some workers make what we consider to be a low wage, whether it's a liquor server wage or some other kind of wage. So we tip to make up for that. But then they make a lower wage because we tipped them. We also want to tip, like North Americans, they like to decide, they like to be independent and tip for good service. They like to have that sort of control over the tip. We've kind of been trained to see it as our right. You know what I mean? It's almost like a power we have over these people. So it's a really interesting thing, and it's not something that I think can be changed overnight by a slightly higher wage.
Right. And like you said, it's kind of like a catch-22 situation where we tip as a social practice as well and to increase wages, but also it affects the minimum wages that a lot of people make, right? And you talked about the spike in tipping during the pandemic. So we've seen more of a social shift in how we look at essential workers and how important they were to keep things running as things were falling apart. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like tipping has significantly increased, right?
Right. I don't know if I would say a spike. So this is from an industry group that represents a lot of restaurants in Canada. And they say that restaurants are reporting higher tips from customers since the pandemic began. But that doesn't necessarily mean that servers are making more money. I do want to note that a lot of these places were closed for quite a long time. And then when they opened back up, for quite a long period of time, and even still now, they weren't seeing the same volume. So a higher tip percentage doesn't necessarily mean a higher payout. And I also want to note that this is not equal. So I actually wrote a story months ago now about how a number of workers were still getting that liquor server minimum wage, even though their tips had pretty much dried up. Maybe someone who was used to fine dining before the pandemic and is super, super happy to see their favorite server again and go to their favorite restaurant, they're probably tipping more, sure. But that doesn't mean that someone in another restaurant, maybe a restaurant with lower prices, maybe more of a takeout restaurant. Like it's not true of all restaurants. And so I don't think we can look at servers and go, unilaterally, all of them are making more in tips. Some of them are, and that's great. But a lot of them are not. And a lot of them, in fact, may still be making less.
Okay, so these legislative changes in wages, how would you see this impacting the restaurant industry after the industry is already facing a lot of critical challenges in the wake of the pandemic, right?
Yeah. So, pretty much across the board, restaurants were not happy about this change. They weren't unhappy about the rise in minimum wage to $15 overall. They weren't happy about the liquor server minimum wage, but more like I think the biggest issue was the lack of time. So they were given 2 months. None of them had any idea this was coming. It wasn't like, oh, they knew and they were waiting for the announcement. They didn't know. So they're given 2 months for what could be a significant cost increase, especially for a larger business, like someone who has multiple restaurants. I mean, it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars for a larger chain. It's a large cost for a business that has already been dealing with a lot of difficulties due to the pandemic. So one can kind of understand their frustration with that. You know what I mean? And then of course, they're going to have to deal with the tip out that we talked about before. More and more restaurants have actually been sort of trying to get more of that tip percentage to go to the back of house, to go to the cooks and the busboys and that kind of thing. And now that gap is going to increase again. So they might be dealing with, the issues of trying to make things fair again. But yeah, overall, I think the biggest issues was just having this change happen at such short notice. It's going to be a cost increase. It's going to be a cost increase like day one for a lot of restaurants. And I think that they're pretty frustrated with that.
Yeah, and I think some restaurants are trying to balance the cost increase in some ways because I've heard from friends there are already some restaurants downtown, in fact, who are banning tips and they're raising the cost of the menu. So these are some of the direct and indirect effects, right? How could that sort of affect labor and consumers if this becomes more widespread, where they're officially banning tips and increasing the cost of the food?
I would back up a little bit on that. I think that some of the most common ways that restaurants are going to mitigate such a large increase in cost is that they're going to try and cut costs in other ways. They might actually have fewer hours for servers. They might have one less server, that kind of thing. So they're going to try and cut costs in other ways to try and make up for that. Restaurant costs are already going up. Labor costs have been going up. Food costs, as we know, have been skyrocketing. And so, we're probably going to see some menu price increases. As one restaurateur pointed out to me last week or the week before, if a menu price increases, often a tip does too, just because the percentage does. But, there's a lot of different ways that restaurants are going to try and deal with this whole host of rising costs, the liquor server minimum wage being just one of them. When it comes to banning tipping, it's interesting. I would be happy to have someone disagree with me, but I don't think it's that widespread. It seems like every few years, even before the pandemic, there's a story about a restaurant or a few restaurants that have made this change, that banned tipping and are paying all their staff, maybe $20 an hour or something. And some of them do that forever. There's also stories about some that went back to tipping. That's something you can Google. It's kind of an interesting thing that we often don't talk about. And then whenever this happens, whenever there's a story about these restaurants, there's always a discussion about whether it's going to become the norm. And as I mentioned, it's pretty hard for something to become the norm. It's pretty hard for something like tipping to be erased. And something like tipping being erased, quite frankly, I don't think it comes from restaurants changing their ways. It comes from the laws changing. So unless the Ontario government wants to suddenly make, restaurant servers all make a minimum of $20 an hour and mandate that tipping goes away, it's not going to go away. It's just not. That's not how it works. I think the pandemic may make it more popular we might see more of those restaurants making that change. But I want to talk a bit about why that model actually doesn't work for a lot of restaurants. And that's just because, I think you'll notice that the restaurants that do away with tipping are often fine dining restaurants. And what they're doing is, instead of tipping, they are raising their menu prices because they have to be able to afford to pay people more. Now, as someone going to the restaurant, I don't think my bill is going to change that much because I'm not tipping anymore. But I can also afford to eat at this restaurant that, costs a little more than some of those low cost restaurants. You know what I mean? I think that not every restaurant can make that kind of change because some people, a lot of customers just wouldn't take it the right way. So while it's nice to talk about an ideal world where all restaurant workers, regardless of what they're doing, make a really decent wage and don't have to rely on tips and wonder how much they're going to have on their next paycheck and all of this, frankly, I don't think it's going to happen unless something really dramatic happened. And that's just me. But again, fight me. I'd be happy to talk more about it.
Yeah, we'll do a post analysis in a year about this.
Yeah. Was Rosa wrong?
So, what about servers? What do they think about this, especially since many of them are racialized people? They come from vulnerable groups as well. To be honest, I don't know who can afford to live on $15 an hour in places like Toronto, where overall in Ontario, living wages are closer to $20 to $22. Would this even cover for the tips that they used to make? Like if tipping as a practice does slightly decrease or is discouraged?
Again, kind of like how restaurant practices are all different. Like it really, really depends. There are some servers who really don't make a lot in tips, and they're going to be really happy to know that they're going to make at least $15 an hour. Although, as you mentioned, $15 an hour in Toronto is a living wage. But so they're going to welcome it. But there are others that are rightfully so worried that employers are going to do exactly what I just said, which is make up for that higher labor cost by adjusting the tip out percentage, maybe taking away some perks, scheduling fewer hours, and thus, maybe they'll end up making the same. They might be concerned that they'll make even less. Like they don't know. It's all so volatile, right? I don't think that customers are as worried about how much people are going to tip. So if menu prices do go up quite a lot, it's definitely possible that customers would tip less or even just go out less in response to that, which then would also impact servers. So there's a lot of things going on where you can't tie them directly to the wage increase, if that makes sense, because obviously the menu prices have to do with more than just wages. But, there's a lot of different things going on. And I think, again, it would really depend on where the server works, how much money they make, how long they've been in the business. And I wouldn't want to speak for any one of them.
And I know this is becoming like an analysis from Rosa episode, but what do you think? What would it take to change the tipping culture? I almost feel like there would be an anti-tipping and a better living wage and working conditions movement to do that, as opposed to like this one change.
Like I said, and I think this is something that we could say for a lot of different things. I say this a lot about climate change in my personal conversations. There are some things that are so ingrained that no single action or no one business or few businesses taking action is going to change the whole culture. And I think that tipping is one of those things. Again, if the government turned around and said, no more tipping, everyone is making 20, I'm just pulling 20 out of my mind. I'm sure that more would be great, that everyone is making a minimum of $20 an hour. Tipping is not allowed. You know what I mean? A lot of people would be angry. And whoever said that probably wouldn't get reelected, but it would happen, right? If that change happened, that would be a change in culture. I mean, there are other changes in culture have happened. Cannabis used to be illegal. Now it's legal. And that was a struggle, but it happened and we're all getting used to it. So it definitely could happen. Like it is theoretically possible. Will it happen without a government making it happen? I don't think so. I just don't.
And as we've clearly established, there's no verdict on this yet. But have you been following some of the online debate around this so far? I think you included a poll as well in your piece about this. What are Ontarians saying right now? Tip or no tip?
Yeah, I was actually interested to see what people would say. So I added a poll to my last story about tipping to see, whether people were planning to tip more or less because of the new server wage. And servers might be happy to hear this. More than half the people who responded said they're not going to change how they tip. And around 10% said they're actually planning on tipping even more because they're so concerned about the businesses and they want people to have to make a living wage. Around 40% said they're going to tip less, though. So, more than half tipping more or the same, 40% tipping less because they know that server wage is going to change. But again, there's so many other factors going on that'll affect people's tips. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see what happens.
On that suspenseful note, we're going to conclude this. Thank you so much for your insight and your time as always, Rosa.
Thanks for taking the time.
I was speaking to the Star's business reporter, Rosa Saba. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Sabai Tazas. The This Matters team is Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bucknick, Raju Mutter, and Sean Pattenton. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenton. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.